Alright, Logic fans, welcome back to our second video on section 1.1. So this is video 1.1b. There's also a 1.1c, but we're going to formally define now our notion of inference, okay? And this is such an important notion that you really need to take the time to understand it in this section, because throughout your entire logic course, you're going to have a really hard time performing well if you don't get this down. The definition has some subtle aspects, but we're going to work through those, and even more if its complexities are covered in the text. So be sure you're doing that and working through the exercises in the textbook. But we say that an argument is valid, okay? So this is our formal definition of inference, if and only if all, and that's crucial, all of its premises are true, then its conclusion must be true. So another way of thinking about it sort of intuitively is that an argument is valid provided that the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. Okay? So when your professor asks you whether or not an argument is valid or invalid, i.e. not valid, okay, they're asking you something really simple. They're asking you to apply this test to that argument. So you sit down to take an exam. The professor puts an argument randomly down in front of you. Suppose it's this one, okay? When they ask you whether or not that argument is valid, they're asking you this question: is the argument such that if all of the premises are true, then its conclusion must be true? Okay, if the answer to that question is yes, the argument is valid. If the answer to that question is no, it is not valid. So students sometimes make the mistake of saying, whether or not an argument is valid basically depends on whether or not it's a good argument, or it's a bad argument, or I like it, or I don't like it, or I think it's silly, or something. Okay, do not use your intuitive notion of validity. They're asking you this technical notion of validity. Okay, and as we saw in the previous video, this argument is valid. Okay, the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. And I want to emphasize again, we will get into the sort of mechanical techniques for demonstrating and proving whether or not an argument is valid later. Right now, we're just sort of operating at the intuitive level and trying to understand the concept. Is the argument such that if all of its premises are true, then its conclusion must be true? If yes, the argument is valid. If no, the argument is not valid, or as we call it, invalid. Okay, so let's try another one to drive the point home. So take a look at this example. Okay, so in this example, you've got two premises and a conclusion. The first premise says, if you're a square, then you're a quadrilateral. True enough, right? If you're a square, then you've got four sides. Fine. The second premise says, you're a quadrilateral. Okay? And it concludes that therefore, based on 1 and 2, you're a square. Now, question, is this argument valid or is it not valid? And by what I mean by that is, if all the premises are true, notice they're not all true. You're not a quadrilateral, right? You're a human being, okay? But if they were all true, suppose, for the sake of argument, they were all true, would they guarantee the truth of the conclusion? Must the conclusion thereby be true, right? Does the truth of the premises, supposing they're all true, guarantee the truth of the conclusion? Pause now and see if you can answer that question. Is this argument valid or invalid in our technical sense of validity? Okay, hopefully you've had a chance to think on it, okay, but the answer is that this argument is invalid, okay? So it's absolutely invalid, okay? It's not valid, all right? So why isn't it valid? Because it is possible for all of the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false. In other words, even if all the premises are true, the conclusion doesn't have to be true. It's not the case that the conclusion must be true. Okay, the truth of the premises does not guarantee the truth of the conclusion. So, of course, it's true that if you're a square, then you're a quadrilateral. And even supposing you were a quadrilateral, you could just be like a rectangle. So if you're a rectangle, then 1 is true, and 2 is true, but 3 is false, right? And so the truth of the premises does not guarantee the truth of the conclusion, and therefore this is an example of an argument which is not valid. It doesn't pass this test. It's not such that if all the premises are true, then its conclusion must be true. All right? Okay, I want to throw a little bit of a curveball at you. Okay, let's try this one together. So we just noted that this argument, and we argued at the end of the last video, 1.1a, that this argument is valid, okay? But take a look at this argument, okay? And the question before us is whether or not this argument is valid or invalid, and your hint is that it shares the exact same logical structure as the argument in red. So this argument in green has the logical structure of the argument in red, and it says all dinosaurs are raspberries. All raspberries are pencils. Therefore, all dinosaurs are pencils. Is this argument valid or is it invalid? Pause now. Okay, hopefully you've had a chance to think on it, but this argument in green is valid. Okay, this absolutely is a valid argument. Okay, it is absolutely valid. It has the exact same logical structure as this, and I know it might sound weird to call this argument valid because it's so crazy, but that's because you're importing your intuitive notion of validity into it rather than this notion. You're asking yourself whether or not you think it's a good argument, or whether you think it's silly, or whether you think it's stupid or something. Okay, that's not what we're asking. Your professor is asking you whether or not this argument passes this test, and it does. I know, of course, all dinosaurs are not raspberries. That's ridiculous. So 1 is false. 2 is false. Even 3 is false. Okay, so all the premises are false. The conclusion is false. And yet that is a valid argument, because if all of the premises are true, supposing they're true, humor me for a second, supposing all of these were true, would it guarantee this? And the answer to that question is yes. So validity has nothing to do with the truth or falsity of the premises or the conclusion, everything to do with the relationship between the premises and the conclusion. Do the premises guarantee the conclusion? If the answer is yes, the argument is valid. If the answer is no, the argument is invalid. Okay? And notice, of course, I tried to set this up this way so that it would make it a little more intuitive for you. But these two arguments share the exact same logical structure, namely, right? And they're valid for the same reason, right? If all of these premises are true, then this must be true. Similarly, if all of these are true, they're not, but if all of these are true, then this must be true. So the arguments are the same as regards their validity, right? The conclusions stand in the same relationship to the premises in both cases. The difference between the two comes in whether or not the premises and the conclusion are actually true. And of course, in this case, the premises and the conclusion are all true. In this case, the premises and the conclusion are all false. So they do, of course, have that difference, and that difference brings us to the all-important notion of soundness. Okay, so soundness, okay, is stronger than validity. All right, so validity is a prerequisite of soundness. So all sound arguments are valid, but not all valid arguments are sound. So an argument is sound if and only if it's valid. So the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. And it's got to be both 1 and 2. All of its premises are true. Okay, so I want you to take the all here very seriously. So if you got an argument and it's got 10,000 premises, okay, and it's valid, and one of those 10,000 premises is false, okay, that argument is not sound. Every single one of the premises, without exception, has to be true, okay? So, based on this definition, all right, which of these arguments, if any, is sound? Pause now and see if you can figure that out. Okay, so hopefully you've had a chance to think about it, right? But this argument in red is sound, okay? This argument in green is not sound, it is unsound, okay? Now, both of the arguments are valid, okay? They are both such that if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. So there's no difference in regards to validity. There is a difference between them in regards to whether or not all the premises are true. Here, all the premises are true. Here, it's not the case that all the premises are true. In fact, all of the premises are false. Now, we just require at least one of them to be false in order for this test to fail, and therefore for it to be unsound. But that's the basic idea. There's no difference between the two of these arguments as regards the inference, right? The fundamental concept of logic for us, okay? There's no difference between them as regards the inference, but there is a difference between them as regards whether or not all of their premises are true. And that's the basic idea here. So typically in logic, you're focused on the notion of validity, because logic can tell you whether or not a conclusion follows from its premises or not. Okay, that is to say, we have mechanical tests for validity, but we don't have mechanical tests for soundness. There's some exceptions where your premises are what we're going to call tautologies, but outside of that, generally speaking, while logic can tell you whether or not an argument is valid, it cannot tell you whether or not all of the premises are true, particularly if the premises are contingent. Logic alone cannot sort of just say, hey, here's a proposition, grass is green, apply this formal test, and oh, we just found out that that statement is true. No, typically claims like that, they involve empirical research of some kind, which is outside of the scope of pure logic. Okay, so what we're going to do in the next video, all right, 1.1c, is we're going to really see how to drive home the difference between validity and soundness, as well as whether or not all the premises are true, whether the conclusion is true or false, and so on. So be sure to check that out, and we'll see you on the next video.